Weston Hale served his wife with divorce papers on a Tuesday morning. She read through them at the kitchen table, set them down, and asked if he wanted coffee. No tears. No raised voice. No questions about why or whether there was someone else. Just coffee. Weston said no and waited for something more. Some reaction he could respond to. Some version of this conversation that felt like what he had prepared for. It never came. She slid the papers back across the table, told him she would have her lawyer look at them by end of week, and went back to whatever she had been reading before he sat down. He left the apartment feeling like a man who had fired a weapon and somehow missed at point-blank range. What Weston did not know was that Elara Sterling had been expecting those papers for 3 weeks. She had already made her call. She had already said the words that would quietly dismantle everything he was about to spend the next 6 months trying to protect. And she had done all of it before he even found the courage to sit down at that table. He thought he was ending the marriage. She had already ended something else entirely. To understand what Weston threw away, you have to understand who he believed he had married. He met Elara 3 years earlier at a gathering on the east side of the city. She was standing near the window with a glass of water, not wine, talking to someone's elderly aunt like it was the only conversation worth having in the room. She was not the loudest person there. She had a calm, unhurried quality that Weston found interesting precisely because it asked nothing of him. He introduced himself. She was warm but not impressed. They dated for 8 months. She was steady. A small apartment, a job she described simply as financial consulting, a life that made no visible demands on anyone. She cooked real food. She remembered what he told her. She did not need to be managed. Weston told his closest friend Declan Pierce she was the most low-maintenance woman he had ever met. He meant it as a compliment. He had no idea what it actually meant. What he never stopped to examine was how many things ran smoothly around him without any visible explanation. The introduction to Holden Grant, the senior developer who became Weston's most valuable professional contact, came through what Weston assumed was a routine networking event. He never knew Elara had arranged the seating at that dinner. The financing problem on his Morrow Street project that resolved itself over a single weekend. He had credited his own persistence. He did not see the call Elara made on a Friday afternoon from the other room. The office lease. The rate he still talked about. He had no idea the other party had been quietly prepared to be agreeable before he walked through the door. None of it was visible. That was the point. Elara had grown up watching what happened when money entered a room too early. The way people reorganized themselves around wealth. The way you could never fully trust that what someone gave you was real and not a calculation dressed up as kindness. So she chose a simpler version of herself, stepped sideways out of the visible life she had been living, and chose Weston inside that version, where he had no idea what she was worth, so she could find out what he was. For 2 years, he had been worth it. Then his career started climbing. And Weston Hale began to change in the slow, quiet way that is the most dangerous kind of change, because the person doing it never sees it happening. That was the moment the marriage actually started ending. Not when he filed the papers. Long before that. Success did not ruin him all at once. He started traveling more, staying out later, coming home with a new energy that had nothing to do with her. He talked more about image, about who was in the room and what that meant for where he was going. The comments started small. The restaurant she suggested was fine but not quite right for a client dinner. Her dress for the awards evening was perfectly nice but not what he had pictured. She should enjoy these events but let him lead the conversation when certain people were around. None of it was a confrontation. Each moment was small enough to explain away. It was only the accumulation that told the real story. He did not lose her in one decision. He lost her in the pattern. Declan saw it before Weston was willing to hear it. He said carefully over drinks one evening that Weston seemed to be editing his life in ways visible to people standing outside it. Weston told him he had always been uncomfortable with ambition. Declan did not push it. But he remembered it. And that would matter later. Bryn Calloway appeared at the margins first. She worked in brand development for a firm connected to one of Weston's projects. Polished, well-networked, exactly the kind of woman who knew how to make a man feel like he was already the version of himself he was still working toward. She occupied rooms in the way Weston had quietly started to feel Elara did not. He told himself it was professional. He told himself that for 4 months. By the 5th, he was returning her messages faster than anyone else's and calling it nothing. Elara saw it. She said nothing. Not because she had no voice. Because she was waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be when he thought no one was watching closely enough to remember. He did not choose well. Weston came home one evening from what he had described as a project dinner. Perfectly composed in all the visible ways. But slightly too composed. The way he moved through the apartment had a practiced quality. The way he asked about her day had the shape of genuine interest but not the weight. She recognized the performance because she had been watching him for 3 years and knew the difference between Weston being present and Weston arranging himself to appear present. She made them both tea, asked a simple question about his week, and listened carefully to what he chose to include and what he chose to leave out. He left out Thursday evening entirely. She already knew about Thursday evening. A message from Sloane Mercer, a woman in her own quiet network, had asked whether Elara was aware that her husband had attended a private dinner that week and left with Bryn Calloway before the evening ended. Elara read it twice. Sat with it. Then replied with 2 words. Thank you. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about trust. About the specific cost of it. About what it meant to have given something carefully and watched it be handled without care. The worst part was not that she knew. It was how long she had hoped she was wrong. Somewhere in those quiet hours, a decision formed. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter and more permanent than either. She was going to let it finish. She was going to let Weston make every choice freely, without interference, and then see what those choices had actually built. She already knew what they had destroyed. The papers arrived on a Tuesday. She read them, closed her laptop, and forwarded everything to her lawyer with one instruction. Process everything. No delays. No negotiation on my end. Her lawyer asked if she was certain she did not want to contest any terms. She wrote back 2 words. Completely certain. What Weston told Declan about the divorce was partial in the way self-justifying accounts always are. Things had run their course. Mutual. Mature. The right decision for both of them. Declan listened without expression. Then asked whose idea it was. Weston said it was a shared conclusion. Declan held his gaze for a long moment. He had known Weston long enough to understand that the truth lived in the pauses, not the sentences. And the pause before that answer had been very long. He asked if Weston was certain about what he was doing. Weston said he had never been more certain about anything. Declan nodded once and said nothing more. But something settled into his expression that stayed there for the rest of the conversation, and Weston noticed it and chose not to ask about it. Elara took almost nothing from the apartment. A few personal items. Books. A small painting Weston had never paid attention to. She packed everything into 2 bags. He stood in the hallway as she reached the door. She turned and looked at him. Not with grief. Not with accusation. The way you look at something you have already made your peace with. She said she hoped he found what he was looking for. Then she walked out. He spent 3 days in the empty apartment before he understood what he was feeling. On the second morning he opened the refrigerator and saw the grocery list on the inside of the door. Her handwriting. Items crossed off, new ones added, a quiet running record of a household she had been maintaining without announcement. He stood looking at it longer than made sense. On the 3rd morning he saw the calendar reminder she had set up 18 months ago. His mother's birthday. Flagged 2 weeks in advance. A note underneath, she likes the bakery on Clement, not the one near your office. He had taken credit for remembering that birthday every year. He had not remembered it once. He sat at the kitchen table and finally identified what he had been feeling since the door closed behind her. The specific silence of a life from which something load-bearing had been removed. Not just a person. The entire quiet infrastructure of being known by someone who paid attention. That was what she had taken when she left. Not furniture. Not money. The evidence that someone had been watching out for him. That was the part he could not undo. Bryn moved into the available space with a fluency that should have told him something. She was at his side at the right events within weeks, good at image management and social architecture. Weston told himself this was alignment. He did not examine the timeline too carefully. Some questions are avoided not because the person cannot find the answer but because they already sense what it is. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Holden Grant's office called to cancel a meeting that had been on the calendar for 3 months. No rescheduled date. 2 weeks later, a conversation with a development group went cold, the follow-up returned by someone junior on the team. Then the Morrow Street refinancing collapsed entirely. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was the project meant to anchor the next 18 months. Financing agreed in principle. No visible reason for it to unravel. It unraveled in a week. He called Declan. Declan came that evening and listened to all of it. When Weston finished, Declan did not offer reassurance. He asked one question. He asked when exactly each of these relationships had started cooling. Weston traced each one back. Grant. The development group. Morrow Street. Every single one had started cooling within weeks of the divorce being finalized. Not before. Not during. After. He told Declan it was coincidence. Declan said quietly that he hoped that was true. His expression said something else entirely. The letter arrived the following Monday. A single page. Plain paper. A man named Asher Vaughan at a firm called Cross Continental Holdings, stating they would be concluding informal support of several business arrangements facilitated on behalf of a former associate. Effective immediately. Weston searched the name. Private Investment Group. Established 30 years ago. For continents. He kept reading until he found the name of the founding family. Cross. Bennett Cross. Elara's father. He pulled everything he could find that evening. The more he read, the more a shape emerged with edges he recognized. A subsidiary connected to the firm that arranged his first office lease. A holding structure 2 steps removed from the Morrow Street lenders. A name in a footnote that connected directly to the group that first introduced him to Holden Grant. He closed the laptop. It was not external pressure he was looking at. It was the revelation of a foundation he had been standing on without knowing it existed. It had never been his. It had been hers. He called Sullivan Hayes the next morning. Hayes had already seen the letter and was waiting for the call. Weston asked how deep it went. Hayes said plainly that a meaningful portion of the infrastructure Weston had built over 3 years had been supported or facilitated by entities connected to the Cross family. Without that support, several of the relationships forming the backbone of his current position would likely not have materialized. Or possibly at all. Weston asked if there was anything actionable. Any legal standing. Hayes said no. Everything had been structured as informal facilitation. No contracts. Nothing enforceable. Constructed very carefully. He called Elara that afternoon. She picked up on the third ring, her voice even, unhurried, exactly as it had always been. Which now felt like a language he had spent 3 years hearing without learning to read. He asked her directly why she had not told him. About her family. About any of it. She said she had wanted to know who he was before any of that entered the room. He said that was not a decision she could make alone. She said she knew there was a word for it. Then she said she had also spent 3 years watching him decide what she was worth based on what he could see of her. And she asked him, quietly, what he had decided. He did not answer. She did not push him to. He said pulling support from a business he had built with his own work was not a proportionate response. She said she hoped he would sit with the difference between what he had built with his own work and what he had built on a foundation he had not known to question. Then she said she had to go. Not coldly. The way a person speaks when they have already said the thing that matters and everything after it would only dilute it. The full picture arrived on a Thursday through a journalist named Emery Collins who covered private capital markets. Collins had been profiling the Cross family for months and reached out to Weston's office for comment on a peripheral connection. Weston called him directly, offered to speak off the record in exchange for what the piece actually covered. They met the following morning. Collins was precise, the kind of person who let facts do the work other people assigned to tone. He opened a folder and talked for 40 minutes. Weston did not speak for most of it. The Cross portfolio contained a division described internally as character investment. When a member of the family formed a significant personal relationship, resources were positioned quietly, not to manufacture outcomes but to create conditions where a person's true nature could emerge without artificial constraint. Remove the struggle and see what someone builds. Remove the ceiling and see how high they reach. Remove the safety net and see what they grab for on the way down. Collins slid a page across the table. Weston's name appeared 4 times. The first notation was dated 2 weeks after he met Elara. He drove home without remembering the drive. Elara had not manufactured his success. She had not handed him anything directly. What she had done was more complicated and more devastating. She had created conditions in which his real nature could emerge without interference. She had made the environment generous and watched carefully what he did inside it. And he had passed for 2 years. For 2 years he had been exactly the person worth investing in. Then the money came in under his own name and the rooms got better and he had taken all of that and used it to decide that the woman beside him was no longer enough. He had failed the test. Not at the beginning. Not when it was hard. He had failed it the moment things got easy. That was the part that stayed with him longest. He found the notebook by accident, moving a box of books Elara had left behind. It slipped from between 2 paperbacks and fell open on the floor. He picked it up and saw the handwriting. Hers. He should have closed it. He did not close it. The entry placed itself in the 2nd year of their marriage. She wrote about watching him at a dinner with colleagues. About the way he had spoken over someone quieter at the table without appearing to notice. About the way he had looked past the waiter when the waiter said something warm and funny. About the way he had mentioned her work that evening as decorative detail rather than genuine substance. She wrote that she was not certain yet. That one evening was not a verdict. That she still believed the man she had watched work and love and try in the first year was closer to the truth of him than these new edges. But she wrote one more thing. She wrote that she was beginning to understand the difference between a person who is good when life is difficult and a person who is good when life is easy. And she was no longer sure which one she had married. Weston sat on the floor with the notebook in his hands and did not move for a long time. He thought about what Collins had said. Remove the safety net and see what someone grabs for on the way down. He thought about what he had grabbed for. A woman who was good at surfaces. Better rooms. A version of his life that looked like the right destination from the outside and felt hollow from within. He had grabbed for exactly what the architecture had been designed to reveal. When he told Declan all of it that night, Declan listened until it was finished. Then he said the hardest part was not that Elara's family had been watching. It was that the notebook existed. Because the notebook was not surveillance. It was a woman genuinely trying to hold on to her belief in him at the exact moment she was starting to lose it. Who had given him the benefit of the doubt in writing never meant to be seen. Who had fought to keep trusting him after the trust was already becoming difficult. She had not left because of what her family's money revealed. She had left because of what Weston revealed when he thought no one was paying close enough attention. Weston looked at his hands and said nothing. The weeks that followed unraveled slowly. He went to work, took meetings, answered emails with the language of a man who understood that the appearance of stability was the only leverage he had left. He carried it alone because there was no version of the telling that did not require him to explain how much of what he had built was not entirely what he had believed. Grant's office cancelled a third time with no rescheduled date. Weston called him directly. Voicemail. He put the phone face down on the desk and left it there. The relationships that held during the restructuring were the ones built entirely through his own sustained work. They were real and they were his. But they were fewer than he had believed. Significantly fewer. Bryn recalibrated with the particular skill of someone who had done it before. Less available when his energy was low. Invitations slightly less frequent. One evening she mentioned a project she was working on with a developer named Griffin Rhodes who had recently moved into the space Weston had been occupying. She mentioned it casually, eyes on her phone for part of it. Then she said Griffin had the same energy Weston had when she first met him. She smiled when she said it. Light. Offhand. Weston smiled back. He did not sleep that night. Because he understood what she had just told him without telling him. He had not been chosen. He had been positioned. And now a newer position had opened and she was simply, professionally, redirecting. He was not a person she had misjudged. He was a resource she had correctly identified and was now correctly replacing. He had left a woman who had quietly built a life around knowing him, for a woman who had never seen him at all. That was the sharpest humiliation of that entire period. Not the business collapse. Not the cross-continental letter. Not even the notebook. His mother Reagan called on a Wednesday evening. She said she had run into Elara at a charity luncheon, that Elara had been warm and gracious and asked after him genuinely. She said she had not known until that afternoon who Elara's family was. A woman at her table had spoken about Elara with a familiarity and respect that reframed the entire afternoon. She said she remembered calling Elara plain. A long pause. She said she owed Elara an apology she would now never have a natural opportunity to deliver. She was not calling to make him feel worse. She was calling because she was his mother and wanted him to hear from someone who loved him that she believed he had made a serious mistake. She hoped he knew what to do with that. Then she said good night. He looked at the apartment after she hung up. Clean. Well furnished. The right size for one person living a life organized around the appearance of forward motion. It felt like a waiting room. The night it fully arrived, he was alone. No particular trigger. It arrived the way certain truths arrive, not as a revelation but as an accumulation that finally exceeds the capacity to deflect. It was not the business he was sitting with. It was the understanding that he had been handed something rare. A woman who had seen enough of the world to be genuinely skeptical of everything and had still chosen to believe in him. Who had built the conditions for his success without asking for credit. Who had written in a private notebook that she was fighting to keep trusting him even as the evidence was turning against it. And he had decided she was not enough. He thought about the grocery list on the refrigerator door. The birthday reminder. The bakery on Clement. All the small invisible ways she had been paying attention while he was busy deciding she was not interesting enough to look at. He had not lost a marriage because he had outgrown her. He had lost a marriage because he had convinced himself that growth meant moving away from things of genuine value instead of toward them. He stopped sleeping through the night sometime in the 5th week. He would surface at 2 or 3 in the morning, make coffee, and sit at the kitchen table. It became the structure of his nights. On a Tuesday in the 6th week he caught himself rehearsing his losses again. The project. The relationships. The woman. The notebook. Every morning, in sequence, without examining why. He looked at that ritual for a moment. Then he understood he had a choice about it. Not about what had happened. But about what he did with his mornings. He finished his coffee and went to get dressed. He met Declan that morning and said plainly that the business was recoverable. Not quickly, not without sustained work from a foundation that was genuinely his, but recoverable. The harder question was Elara. He had spent 6 weeks treating the damage as a wound to manage rather than information to act on, and he thought that was the wrong orientation. What he wanted was to talk to her. Not to ask for anything. Not to make a case he had not earned the right to make. But because he had communicated a great many things to her over the last year of their marriage through his choices and his silences, and very few of those things were true to who he actually was. She did not owe him a conversation. But he owed her one regardless. Declan looked at him for a moment. Then said that was the first thing Weston had said in 6 weeks that sounded like him. That afternoon Weston called Hayes and asked if anything in the divorce settlement was genuinely unfair to Elara. Any term she had accepted that served him at her expense. Hayes called back 2 hours later. A shared account divided in Weston's favor. A property arrangement that defaulted to his preference because Elara's counsel had not contested it. Both settled. No legal obligation to revisit. Weston told him to correct both items in Elara's favor voluntarily. It was not a gesture designed to be seen. If it reached her at all, it would reach her through paperwork, not a conversation. There would be no moment where he could watch her receive it and feel better about himself in the watching. That was precisely why it was the right thing to do. He went back to work with a different orientation. Direct with people about the restructuring, not performing confidence he did not have. Some left. Several stayed and responded with warmth he had not earned through performance. Slower. Less impressive from the outside. Real in a way the previous version had not been. When Bryn called on a Thursday evening he answered because he was done avoiding things. She suggested dinner. He said he did not think that was a good idea, that what they had was not what he had told himself when it started, and continuing it was not honest to either of them. She said he was making a mistake. He said he appreciated that. He wished her well and meant it. He ended the call and sat with a quiet that was different from the quiet he had been living in for 6 weeks. Not empty. Just clear. That evening he drafted a message to Elara. Spent 2 hours on it. Read it back once. Then closed it without sending, because a message was not enough. Sending carefully constructed words and waiting to see how they landed was still a version of managing the situation from a distance. If he was going to be honest with her, he needed to do it in person. Finding Elara was not difficult. That was the first thing that humbled him. He had spent 6 weeks constructing her absence as something vast and unreachable, and when he finally asked Declan if he knew where she was, Declan gave him an address without hesitation. He asked how long Declan had known. Declan said a while. He asked why Declan had not offered it earlier. Declan said because earlier, Weston had not been the version of himself worth sending to her door. He did not argue with that. She was living in a quiet part of the city. Older buildings, character instead of profile. He drove there on a Saturday morning and sat outside for 10 minutes before he got out of the car. Not from fear. Because he wanted to be completely present for what came next. No rehearsed lines. No version of himself positioned for best effect. He rang the bell. A pause. Long enough that he wondered. Then footsteps. The door opened. Elara looked at him without surprise. Which told him she had already made some decision about whether to open the door before her hand ever touched the handle. She had opened it. That meant something. She said his name. Not a greeting, not a question. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he was there. He said he was not there to ask for anything. She stepped back from the door. The apartment was alive in a way his was not. Books open face down on surfaces. Tea still steaming on the table. A jacket over a chair suggesting a life in active progress. He sat where she indicated. She sat across from him and waited. He had decided on the drive over not to open with an apology. An apology first was still a way of centering himself, making his guilt the subject before she had a chance to be the subject. So he started with the truth instead. He told her about Collins. The document with his name 4 times, the first notation dated 2 weeks after they met. He told her he understood now what had been built around him and what its purpose had been. She listened without expression. He told her about the notebook. About sitting on the floor for a long time afterward. Something moved through her eyes at that. Brief, quickly controlled, but present. He said he was not there to make her feel guilty. He was there because she had given him something real. Her actual self, not the version that carried the weight of her family name, but the person underneath it who read books and remembered things and cared about people without performing the caring. He had received that and over the course of a year communicated to her, through his choices and his silences and his reaching for something more visible, that it was not enough. That was not the truth of what she was worth. It was the truth of what he had been willing to see at a particular moment of his own weakness. He said he had not come to ask her to reconsider anything. He understood what had been broken and his role in breaking it. He had come because she had spent 3 years being honest with him in every way that mattered and he had never fully returned that. He was done letting that be the last true thing between them. Elara looked at her hands for a moment. Then looked up. She said she had known within the first year that something was shifting in him. She had wanted it to be a phase. The notebook entry was accurate, she said. She had been fighting to keep trusting him past the point where the evidence was supporting it. Then she said the thing he had not been prepared for. She said the divorce did not break her. Watching him become that man did. She said it plainly. Without drama. The way people say the truest things, because the truth does not need volume. He had nothing to respond with. She was not wrong and they both knew it. After a moment she said she had not spoken during the marriage because she had wanted to know what he would do on his own. Whether he would find his way back to himself without being pulled there. She had stayed too long hoping for an answer that was not coming. He said that was fair. She said it was not a verdict on who he was permanently. It was what happened when a particular kind of ambition met a particular absence of resistance and no one was asking the hard questions out loud. She had not asked them out loud. He said she had written them down in private and given him the benefit of the doubt in writing never meant to be seen. More generous than he had deserved. Then she told him something he had not known. After the divorce was filed, she had been contacted by 2 journalists who had heard fragments of the cross-continental story and wanted her account. She had declined both. Given them nothing. Not because she owed him protection, but because she had decided that whatever he had become, she was not willing to be the one who finished him. She did not want him to take that as a signal of anything. She just thought he should know. He sat with that for a moment. A woman who had every reason to let the story break publicly, who had been handed the opportunity, and had chosen to say nothing. Not for him. For herself. Because that was not the kind of person she was. He had divorced that person. She said she had not known about the voluntary corrections to the settlement until the documents arrived. He said he had not sent them for her to know about them. She looked at him steadily and said she knew that. Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Not reconciliation. Not a return to what had been. The recognition of 2 people who had known each other in a real way, failed each other in different ways, and were now finally telling each other the truth about all of it. She got up and made tea. Her cup had gone cold and she wanted another. He sat at the table and the ordinary domesticity of it was more affecting than anything that had been said. She brought 2 cups back and sat down. He asked about her life. Not the business, not the family. Her actual life in this apartment in this quiet neighborhood. She talked for a while. The foundation work. Reconnecting with people she had let drift during the marriage. Her own failures, the moment she had chosen the test over the conversation and sometimes wondered whether a different choice would have changed the outcome. He listened without trying to use any of it to build a case. She noticed that. He could tell by the slight shift in how she held herself across the table. A fraction less careful. He stayed 2 hours. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He said he was glad she had opened it. She said she had almost not. He asked what made her decide to. She said she had watched him sit in the car for 10 minutes and seen something in how he eventually got out. The absence of performance in it. No composed expression arranged for arrival. Just a man getting out of a car and walking to a door. She said it was the first time in a long time that what she saw matched what she knew about him at his actual best. He said he was working on closing the distance between those two things more permanently. She looked at him for a moment before answering. Her hand tightened slightly around the door, just once, before she spoke. She said she knew. He asked if that meant something. She said it meant the door was not closed in the way it had seemed from the outside. It did not mean anything faster than what it actually was. A beginning. A real one. Without the invisible architecture underneath it. Without the test or the question that had run quietly beneath 3 years of marriage. Just two people who knew each other honestly at last. He nodded. Walked back to his car. Did not look back at the door because he did not need to. For the first time in a year he understood exactly where he stood. The rebuilding was not cinematic. No single morning where the weight lifted. No conversation that closed everything cleanly. Just a long sequence of ordinary days that slowly, through accumulation, began to feel different from the ones that had preceded them. The business took 14 months to restabilize. The relationships that held were the ones built entirely through his own work. Some that had seemed solid left without ceremony. He let them go without chasing. Holden Grant called in the 9th month. Direct line, no preamble. He said he had watched since the divorce and seen a man doing unglamorous, honest work without the performance of resilience he had expected. He had a project that needed Weston's actual skill set and was no longer interested in letting discomfort make his decisions. Weston thanked him and meant it without the edge of desperation that used to live underneath that word. Reagan drove across the city one Sunday with food she had cooked herself. They ate together and talked about smaller things. Then she said she had been thinking about what she had said. About Plain. About profile. About the judgment she had made when Elara was present in their lives. She said she had been measuring the wrong things. At the door she held his face in her hands the way she had when he was small. She said he seemed different. Quieter. In the way he had been before the ambition got loud. She said she preferred this version. He said so did he, and he meant it without qualification. Declan got married in the spring. Small ceremony. Weston was best man. At the reception he sat with people he mostly did not know and found, to his own surprise, that he was not performing anything. Simply present. Listening when people talked. Declan found him later near a window and asked about Elara. They had been meeting occasionally for 3 months by then. Coffee. Walks. Once for dinner at the quiet kind of place she had always preferred. They talked honestly, which was something they had never fully managed inside the marriage and were discovering they were both capable of outside it. She told him the full version of her life. He listened without trying to use any of it to build a case. The distance that had lived in their silences during the final year of the marriage was gone. What remained was the directness that had been there at the very beginning, before either of them had started managing the other. It was not the beginning again. They were not those people. Too much had passed through both of them. It was something with no previous version to compare itself to. He did not name it. She did not name it. They were both done moving faster than things actually were. On an afternoon in early autumn he walked to her apartment and rang the bell. She opened the door without the pause that had been there the first time. She just opened it. He had brought nothing. He stood at the door and told her he had one question. She said she was listening. He asked if she was willing to find out what this was. Not what it had been. What it actually was now, between two people who had stopped performing and had already seen each other at their worst and were still standing. He was not asking for a decision. He was asking if she was willing to keep finding out. Elara looked at him for a moment. Then she said she had been willing for a while. She had been waiting for him to find the right way to say it. He said he was sorry it had taken this long. She said she knew. Not harshly. Not as a wound. Just as a fact that belonged to both of them equally and that neither of them needed to keep carrying alone anymore. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. They did not talk about the future that evening. No plans, no definitions. They sat at her kitchen table and drank tea and talked about ordinary things and let the silence between the ordinary things be what it was. Comfortable. Honest. Theirs. At some point she laughed at something he said. Not polite. The real one, the one he had not heard in longer than he wanted to count. And he thought about the man who had sat across from her a year ago in a marriage that was quietly ending and had not understood what he was in the process of losing. He did not say that out loud. Some things do not need to be said between two people who have finally stopped hiding from each other. He left late. At the door she looked at him the way she always had when she was not managing anything. Direct. Unhurried. Seeing him clearly and at peace with what she saw. He walked to his car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about 3 years. About the test he had not known he was taking and the way he had failed it not in one dramatic moment but in 100 small ones. He thought about the notebook on the floor. About a woman who had written down her doubts in private and then chose to believe in him anyway. About a woman who had been handed opportunities to let a story destroy him and declined all of them without telling him. He would never fully deserve that. He understood it now in a way that would not crush him but would never fully leave him either. It would stay with him as a reminder of what he had nearly become and what it had cost to step back from it. Not the same person. Not yet who he intended to become. Somewhere in between, which is the only honest place any person ever actually stands. He started the car and drove forward. Not because everything was repaired. Because enough was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was sufficient.